So my name is Dr. Ty McKinney. I'm one of the co-founders of Bit Cortex, who is one of the companies that's sponsoring this webinar series. And the focus of this one is going to be on neurodivergence and entrepreneurship, with a particular focus on ADHD. And just to give a little bit of context for where this event is coming from. So a number of companies here out of Calgary, we wanted to host a webinar series on the idea of raising capital, because since that's topical for a lot of different startups. But we wanted to start off with the first one being this idea of personal capital. How are you able to start investing in yourself before you start seeking internal investment, and really making sure that you've got all your things lined up so that way you can kind of do the best job as it comes to yourself as a business owner. And I was really grateful that all the other organizations that we're partnered with were really supportive of this idea and really wanted this to be a good opportunity for just everyone to get some experience and insight into how ADHD in particular isn't necessarily a disease that needs to be cured, a liability for a company, but rather a different set of assets they bring to the table that can be complemented within a broader team. So I'm really glad that I'm working with such a progressive group of other organizations and companies in order to bring this to you. So to start off with everything, let's turn to this initial fact that university students with ADHD are almost twice as likely to pursue entrepreneurship as other students. So this is quite striking. To anyone that has a background in statistics, anytime you have an effect that's twice as likely as something else, that usually means you've got something real happening, something real going on. So in this webinar, we're going to really dive into what is the reason for this particular statistic and try to get some insight into, again, changing the nature of the conversation about what ADHD is. And this is part of a broader conversation and social movement around this concept of neurodivergence. So neurodivergence originally started around the condition of autism spectrum disorder. When it became apparent that people with autism, particularly in Silicon Valley, they had a skill set and a way of doing things that actually was highly advantageous for particular types of positions. And up until this point, conditions like autism were thought of a disease that needed to be cured or that needed to be treated or managed in some capacity. But as Silicon Valley started to show us, there is this opportunity for this differing skill set to really be advantageous and helpful once they're put into the right circumstance. And this term of neurodivergence has really started to expand beyond that so far to start to include other neurodevelopmental disorders and mental health conditions like ADHD. So this webinar is really all about diving into how this concept of neurodivergence with ADHD, specifically as it relates to entrepreneurship, to hopefully explain why is it that so many people with ADHD seem positioned to start companies and how we can be more thoughtful about leveraging this unique skill sets. So just to give you a quick overview of the agenda we'll be going through today, I'm going to start by introducing you to this concept of developmental psychopathology as kind of this overarching framework that I'm going to be using for thinking about ADHD and entrepreneurship before diving into the details of this relationship itself and really getting into the neurobiology, so the neuroscience of why is there this relationship and how can it be more beneficial. And then we'll briefly get into thinking about other mental health conditions, again, trying to expand this conversation for neurodivergence. And each of those other conditions could be the topic of a webinar in and of themselves. So this is really just going to be a conversation starter. And then finally, we want to really make sure that this is an engaging and interactive webinar. So we'll finish off with some question and answer to really get a sense of how everyone's individual experience has related to some of the content that we are discussing today. I often find it very helpful to think about things from an evolutionary lens, from the perspective of evolutionary biology. It's really good if you want to think about why something is the way it is to think about what forces and design processes help give shape to the functionality of something. So this is a perspective I find really helpful when I think about psychology and mental health, because oftentimes we have these environmental pressures that have been acting upon us as a species that kind of give rise into why we are the way we are. And what's really important to consider from this evolutionary biology perspective is these changes, these environmental pressures, they're very, very gradual. They take place over hundreds, thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of years. So it's a very slow process. And it's very effective at helping us go from apes into the humans that we are today and all the things that we can love and hate about us. But while evolution has done a really good job of preparing us for the overall environment of Earth, it doesn't prepare us for quite as good of a job of more short time scale things. And this is where the field of epigenetics starts to really come into play. So whereas evolutionary biology is really concerned about genes, it's thinking about what are the features of an individual that is it's going to make them more likely to succeed, either in an overall survival capacity in the sense that they literally do not die from dangers in their environment, or from a reproductive capacity in the sense that they're able to find a partner, a mate, and reproduce and continue on the cycle of life. So epigenetics takes a much more focal perspective and thinks like, okay, well, so we've got these genes and they're like instructions for individual cells, but what decides how they might get turned on or off? And this is where the environment comes in. So the environment is the situation we find ourselves in. And one way that you can think about it is it's the instructions for turning on which genes are going to be expressed. So we all have genes inside of our body for determining whether or not any given cell is going to become a brain cell or a muscle cell or a skin cell. And it's epigenetics that decides what kind of cell it's going to be turned into and under what conditions those more subtle features are going to be turned on. And overall, this relates to the phenotype, which is a combination of both the genes and the environment. So while genes do play a role, oftentimes they're not determinant in what our capacities are going to be. And the environment is influential, but in and of itself is not going to be overall consequential. But it's the interaction between both of them, where if you have a genetic predisposition to develop in a certain way, and there's the environmental selection pressures present, that's what's going to decide what the phenotype is ultimately going to look like. So there's often a push to try to understand the dance between genes and the environment. And this really comes to play within the perspective of developmental psychopathology, which is in many ways analogous to this evolutionary biology perspective, except it takes the time span of an individual life. So one way that you can think about this is as a baby, and even before we're even born, when we're still in the womb, our brain is trying to get a sense of what environment are we going to grow up into, and how can we change and adapt accordingly so that we can be best positioned to deal with the opportunities that that environment will afford, as well as mitigate the risks and liabilities that will be present in that environment as well. And then there's this constant interplay between our early life experiences in shaping how our brain is going to grow and develop as we age and start improving our functionality. And one really important set of early life experiences that we have to consider are those of adversity. So adverse childhood experiences is one way that neuroscience researchers will often try to understand and quantify some of the different adverse experiences that kids might experience growing up. This can include things as you might expect, such as abuse and neglect, and this can be either physical or emotional, but can also include other slightly more subtle dysfunctions that can be present within the household, such as a close family member having a mental illness, or the presence of substance abuse within the household, or if the parents in the house had a divorce or some sort of separation. These are all experiences that can make one's childhood just a little bit more tumultuous and uncertain. And unfortunately, it's the case that kids that have more than 4 of these ACE experiences are more than twice as likely to develop ADHD. So this suggests that there is this link between early childhood adversity and the likelihood to develop ADHD. And by extension, there's even the possibility this could potentially explain the relationship between ADHD and entrepreneurialism. So this is kind of the starting place for our developmental psychology discussion over the course of the evening. And I just saw that there was one question in the chat about whether or not even before birth, some of these changes can start to take place. And that's actually exactly true. So when you're in utero, the experience of your mother actually can have a huge impact on how the baby starts to develop. So for example, in the second trimester, if there's a lot of stress in the mother's life, this will actually start to signal to the baby that they might be born into a environment that's going to be harsh and not particularly kind. So then the unborn baby is going to start changing their developmental trajectory accordingly. So this is a very exciting area of research that I'm going to acknowledge that I don't have the most expertise in, but I could be more than happy to point towards other people who are experts within this for some of those specific linkages. But then turning the question to ADHD a little more specifically, the question then becomes, how does these adverse experiences start to facilitate the development of ADHD? So there's a couple kind of big picture tendencies I want to point out before I get into more specific symptoms. So one way that you can think about these adverse early experiences is that it's more or less creating this sense of a scarcity mindset, that there's limited resources available and there's some sort of competitive process necessary in order to acquire those resources, that you need to outcompete other people. And prior literature scientific literature has shown that a scarcity mindset actually promotes risk-taking behaviors. So this idea that nothing's necessarily for certain, and if nothing's for certain, might as well take a gamble, because why not? Who knows? Anything's better than the status quo. And one other thing that the literature has really helped identify is that people that grow up in these early childhood experiences are what we call stress-adapted people, meaning that their biology is really accustomed to expecting there to be constant stress within their lifestyle. And that if there's actually not a source of stress in these people's lives, that they might not actually be feeling like they're living life to their fullest. So these are two very broad tendencies that can start to push towards someone to developing ADHD and potentially also wanting to be entrepreneurial. Whereas if you already have this disposition for wanting to take risks and your biology is already adapted in such a way that you're well positioned to thrive within stressful circumstances, these are some of the raw ingredients that might make one a good entrepreneur. However, thinking about some of the more specific ADHD symptoms, they can largely be classified into two broad categories, those of inattention and those of hyperactivity. So when it comes to the inattentive symptoms, how I like to conceptualize these is an inability or an unwillingness to engage with your external environment. If things around you are really depressing, if they're really tumultuous, there's a lot of uncertainty and danger, sometimes it might be more adapt to just kind of disengage from that and turn your focus internally. And oftentimes this will manifest as a lot of inattention to detail, or being somewhat disorganized because you're not keeping track of all the different things, or being forgetful or distracted. But oftentimes, people aren't allowed to just kind of be inattentive. So the hyperactive symptoms of ADHD are in many ways thought to be a response to the inattentive symptoms. More or less, you can think about these as a way for kids to be able to self-stimulate in order to make their environment more engaging so that they're a little better able to thrive. So oftentimes this will manifest as things like fidgeting or speaking out of term or just having a lot of energy. So someone made a comment that ADHD is usually not characterized as a developmental process, but it's characterized as something that we're born with. So that's a little bit more of actually an old school way of thinking, whereas a lot of the newer neuroscience evidence is really suggesting that it's a combination of both your genes, which is that predisposition that you would be born with, in combination with your early childhood experiences. So this is relatively new research. So I'd be happy to follow up with anyone. Yeah, the nature and the nurture component. So it's not necessarily one or the other, but it's both kind of playing together at the same time. So just getting a little bit more concrete when thinking about this idea of entrepreneurship, so let's start to think about some of the overlap between the lifestyle that an entrepreneur might take and some of the life experiences that people with ADHD often have. So to start off, there's often a lot of uncertainty. To anyone that has started a business, you may have realized that there's not necessarily a solid plan on how to go about doing that. Whereas with ADHD, a lot of these early adverse experiences, oftentimes there's a lot of ambiguity over how to best navigate situations. There's often high degrees of stress in both life trajectories, whether or not it's from not really knowing where the resources might come from to just the demands of having to start off your own business. Both entrepreneurs and people with ADHD often have to take risks and manage risks, because they might be doing that in various ways. So I'll follow up with this in just a moment. Additionally, there's oftentimes people with ADHD often feel the need that there's a challenge that they have to face. Going back to the idea that their brain is evolved to really thrive in these high stress environments, and a challenge is one way to challenge that stress in a more positive way, which is often what calls to a lot of people that are entrepreneurial. There's also a lot of task switching. There's been some evidence out of the University of Utah by Dr. Bruce Ellis about how people that have these early adverse experiences, they're actually much more adapted to constantly switching between tasks rather than staying on board with one particular task for a more extended period of time. And oftentimes people that are starting up their own business have to juggle multiple different hats and constantly switching from being the marketing person to the strategy person to the finance person. And there can be lots of interplay and different roles they need to have. And then finally, this idea that extroversion tends to be rewarded in the startup life, as well as with ADHD, in the sense that those fidgeting, those hyperactive symptoms are one way that people are able to start to more or less change the environment to be a little more adaptive for themselves. So these are some general overlap between the broad trajectories of someone that may have experienced ADHD and had some of those early life adversity experiences, as well as those that are pursuing entrepreneurship. So we can start to dive in a little bit more concretely. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this idea of risk and how we can manage it. Has anyone ever heard of the marshmallow test? Quickly, we could put that into the chat. Very briefly, it's a test that we'll use in lots of developmental psychology experiments where they'll give kids one marshmallow and they'll have the choice of either one marshmallow now, or in 5 minutes, they can more or less double up the reward and get 2 marshmallows. So this is a test of delayed gratification. And what a lot of developmental psychology studies have found is that the people who are able to delay their gratification and do the 2 marshmallows a little bit later, they often have, broadly speaking, success metrics later on in life, in the sense that they often have higher academic outcomes. Sometimes they'll have better health outcomes or engage in less risky health behaviors. And a lot of people that have ADHD might be much more inclined to do the 1 marshmallow now. And previously, the conceptualizations of this would be viewed as them failing the marshmallow test. Whereas instead, one way that I would like to challenge this perspective is that they're just taking advantage of opportunities that are presented right now. In the sense that if you're not used to consistently having resources, taking advantage of an opportunity for marshmallow right now might actually be the best way to manage the risk that's presented to you. So again, this is thinking about different ways in which risk can be managed, and how people with ADHD might be much more inclined to take opportunities as they present, potentially at the detriment to more long-term planning. But again, this is why it takes many different minds in order to make a venture a success. The other thing that I want to mention is the Yerkes-Dodson curve of task performance. So this is a well-studied phenomenon within cognitive psychology, in that there is a curvilinear relationship between how much arousal or dopamine is present within someone and what their task performance is. In the sense that you want to be right in the middle, where there's that sweet spot where you've got just enough dopamine in order to turn on your executive functioning networks and be able to engage in a task and perform at a high degree. And if you don't have enough dopamine, this often leads to some degree of drowsiness or symptoms of inattention. And if you have too much dopamine, this can often manifest as anxiety. Or some degree of cognitive impairment, where people are too worked up, but they're not able to properly engage their executive functioning networks, their ability to engage their focused attention to meet the demands of the task. So people with ADHD, they often tend to hang out at the very low end of this Yerkes-Dodson curve. So a lot of things that people with ADHD are doing is finding ways to increase the level of dopamine in themselves, either through those hyperactive tendencies, or by modifying their environments and make it a little bit more engaging and for them. So this is where a lot of times there's a preference for novelty, and a lot of people that might have ADHD, because novelty is one of those things that can be present. Oh, we just got a question in the chat. What is NE and DA? Those are shorthands for noradrenaline and dopamine, or norepinephrine if you want to use the British term. So those are 2 different neurotransmitters that are really important for the sense of arousal and our ability to turn on our focus networks and kind of put our head down and do some work. And people with ADHD, based on those genetic predispositions, they tend to have overall lower levels of dopamine at baseline, which is why they are drawn to these high energy situations. They tend to be a lot more extroverted, because that's a way for them to kind of get the noradrenaline and the dopamine up to a higher level into that more optimal portion of the curve. This is one way in which a preference for novelty and extroversion can be potentially beneficial. The other thing that I want to talk about is this idea of being a stress-adapted person. So as we previously discussed, a lot of the early adverse childhood experiences that can lead someone towards developing ADHD can actually make them so that they thrive in highly stressful circumstances if they have the opportunity to channel their stress accordingly. So I want to go through a few specific examples of how this can play out within the entrepreneurial space. Now we have an appreciation for how ADHD could potentially be beneficial for managing risk. So the first one is this idea of short-term rewards over long-term rewards. So as I mentioned with the marshmallow test, people with ADHD, they often have a bit of a preference for short-term rewards, and they sometimes discount the longer-term rewards. But this can actually be very beneficial in certain situations. Again, if you think about positions like sales or networking or marketing, where there are these kind of short little incremental rewards along the way, people with ADHD often thrive in these kinds of positions because they're highly motivated by those small interim rewards, and those are able to kind of keep them going. Whereas if there's just one bigger reward over a longer time scale, they might be a little less motivated by that just because their brain isn't quite wired in order to recognize those in the same capacity. So this can be one way in which people with ADHD can perhaps strategize the way in which they set up their company or their work environment to really thrive. What are ways in which you can bake in a lot of smaller term rewards along the way to really keep them motivated and engaged rather than relying on a really distant long-term reward that might not quite resonate with them as well. And as anyone that's been in the startup life is know, pivoting is really crucial for success. And because people with ADHD often are geared towards doing lots of task switching, they're often very expert pivoters. So they're able to, get up to speed on a new skill set relatively quickly, or appreciate how their current skill set could be transitioned into a new direction. And this could be very, very adaptive in an entrepreneurial setting, where oftentimes as you're trying to find value, you're constantly updating exactly what your business model is and how you're going to be approaching it. So this is, while a lot of people can find this highly stressful, this is one particular skill set that people with ADHD have a one-up on. And then finally, this idea of oftentimes when you're in a very stressful situation, if you can somehow channel it as a challenge, this can be really beneficial overall for your performance. So a lot of times when a startup is pitched as, it's a really big challenge for people to try to overcome, this can be really enticing for people with ADHD because it's a way for them to take their tendency to thrive in stressful environments, but have a more clear goal. And it's something that can be personally motivating for everyone. So this is one way in which, again, people with ADHD can be very well positioned for entrepreneurship. But one thing that I want to really highlight for everyone is that these tendencies are not a silver bullet for entrepreneurship. They're not necessarily going to make every venture a success. And that these people with ADHD, they still do have a brain that's wired to work slightly differently than neurotypical people. So as a result, they're going to need some degree of support. Any great venture in human history has never been done alone. It's always required a team of people that have complementary strengths and weaknesses to supplement each other. And the same is true for people with ADHD. While they have a lot of innate benefits towards starting up their own business and trying to thrive in the startup space, they're also going to need complementary skill sets from other people within their team, which is why it's really important when they're thinking about who they want to hire and who they want to bring on as collaborators to think how there potentially could be some cross collaboration going on. And the reason why this is really important is because as people with ADHD are trying to be pushed along the Yerkes-Dodson curve towards this more optimal level of dopamine in order to have that optimal task performance, is we don't want to necessarily add too much stress so they go over to the other side of the curve where they're starting to get anxiety and some degree of impairment in their attention. And this is where the people with the other people on the team can be really supportive and complementary and trying to help keep everyone on the team within that more optimal range. That's overall how we can start to think about how being thriving in a stress-adapted lifestyle in the early life can actually be quite beneficial for people in later life as they set off on their entrepreneurial journey. But as I said, ADHD is just one condition over many, and there's lots of different ways in which we can start to think about this term of neurodiversity. So I'm just going to talk about a few conditions and how they can potentially be beneficial in a startup environment. So the first one that I want to talk about is anxiety. So people with anxiety have a disposition to be very aware of what could go wrong in the future, and they're often very motivated to take proactive actions in order to mitigate the likelihood of those adverse outcomes. So while this can be impairing and definitely very distressing for a lot of people, this can also be really beneficial if their role is to manage that risk. So people that have anxiety can often make really good compliance officers or lawyers or people that have to manage risk in some capacity and really be aware of what are those highly unlikely but highly disruptive events that you don't want to have happen, because they're going to be very proactive in doing things to make sure that those events don't come around to where it's happening. Another condition that I briefly mentioned is autism spectrum disorder. So one of the characteristic features of ASD is that there's restricted and repetitive interests. And well, for the longest time, this was seen as something that needed to potentially be fixed or wasn't very helpful. We started to see, particularly in Silicon Valley, that if those restrictive interests are channeled towards something that a company can find beneficial, this can be a very mutually beneficial relationship, and that those niche behaviors that people with autism spectrum disorder are gravitated towards, if they're able to really channel that towards a startup, this can be very mutually beneficial and really find a niche for these people where they might otherwise not have been able to. So again, autism was one of the initial disorders that really started to coin this term of neurodivergence, and thinking about how we don't necessarily have good versus bad brains so much as brains that are adapted for this kind of skill set versus that kind of skill set, and how we can use them both accordingly in different situations. And again, how we can be complementary within a broader team. And then finally, we have depression is the last disorder that I'll talk about. So people with depression, in my experience professionally, thinking about the neurobiology, they have a tendency to want to conserve energy. So they don't necessarily want to expend effort because their life experiences may have put them in such a way that, if they really try and go out there, that effort might not necessarily pay off. So this is often being termed in the scientific literature as learned helplessness, or more recently, decisional anhedonia, meaning that they're not able to take the potential benefits of an action into consideration when they're deciding what they want to do. And this can lead people towards depression, towards really not engaging in a lot of high energy, but potentially high output behaviors. However, if you need to create a process where you have minimal effort involved, a person with depression is exactly your person. So they're going to be really good at automating tasks. They're highly motivated to not want to put in the energy necessary during the process. So if they have the opportunity to automate the process, you're going to get the most efficient way to do things potentially possible. So again, this is one way in which the tendencies of someone with depression might actually be highly beneficial if they're put into a situation with a role that leverages their unique tendencies and abilities.